And all of it started with one radical idea. If the bombs are coming, let's decide where they land. This was not just defense. This was chess on a national scale. A strategic masterpiece that used illusion instead of firepower, creativity instead of destruction, intelligence instead of brute force. And the most insane part? Most of these decoy cities remained secret for nearly 70 years, hidden in old documents, locked inside classified files, forgotten by history, until now. These ghost towns, these cities that never existed, became silent heroes of WWII. They didn't shoot, they didn't fight, but they saved a nation by pretending to be one. This was the psychological genius of Britain's decoy system. It didn't just fool the enemy, it redirected the war. Every bomb that fell on a fake airfield was a bomb that didn't fall on a hospital. Every explosion in a ghost town was an explosion that didn't collapse a school. Every fire set by the enemy burned harmlessly in places designed to burn. And what makes this even more extraordinary is that these decoy cities were not small. They stretched across miles. They were built in open fields, on farmlands, near coasts, in rural valleys, everywhere the enemy might look. Some of them were so big that even modern drones flying with HD cameras have trouble distinguishing them from real historical photos. Yet at the time, the British population didn't know anything about them. Most people hiding in underground shelters believed the bombs missed by luck. They believed the city had survived another night because fate had protected them. They had no idea that miles away, in the darkness, a fake London or a fake Birmingham was taking the hit for them. The secrecy was intentional, because if even a rumor leaked that these sites existed, the enemy could piece together the truth, and once the truth was discovered, the illusion would die. But during the war, no one broke cover. No one talked. No one leaked. The system worked because the silence worked. And the more Germany bombed the decoys, the more confident they became that they were hitting real targets. This allowed Britain to manipulate enemy strategy without firing a single shot. It was deception raised to the level of art. Architecture turned into camouflage. City planning turned into illusion. War turned into theatre. Imagine walking through one of these sites in the daytime. It would look almost comically fake. Wooden outlines of buildings, imitation factories made from canvas, fake fuel tanks crafted from painted metal. But at night, under carefully positioned lights and shadows, everything transformed. The skies lied, the landscape lied, and the enemy believed the lie. That belief saved tens of thousands of lives. That belief changed the outcome of the Blitz. That belief turned Britain's weakness, the lack of manpower, lack of aircraft, lack of infrastructure, into a new kind of strength, brilliance, creativity and psychological warfare. And all of it started with one radical idea. If the bombs are coming, let's decide where they land. This was not just defense. This was chess on a national scale. A strategic masterpiece that used illusion instead of firepower, creativity instead of destruction, intelligence instead of brute force. And the most insane part? Most of these decoy cities remained secret for nearly 70 years, hidden in old documents, locked inside classified files, forgotten by history, until now. These ghost towns, these cities that never existed, became silent heroes of WWII. They didn't shoot, they didn't fight, but they saved a nation by pretending to be one. You're about to hear one of the strangest, least believable truths of World War II. A truth so unusual that if you didn't know it was fully documented, you'd think it came straight out of a Hollywood war movie. Because Britain's decoy cities, those ghost towns that tricked the German Luftwaffe, weren't designed by generals or explosive experts. They were designed by artists, by painters, by theatre set designers, by stage lighting engineers, by people whose careers just months earlier involved making fake castles for plays and lighting up opera stages. But the war changed everything. When the Blitz began, Britain didn't just need soldiers. It needed deception artists, people who could create illusions, strong enough to fool pilots traveling at lethal speeds through a sky full of chaos, people who understood how shadows work, how light bends, how perspective tricks the human eye, people who could take an empty field and turn it, almost magically, into the convincing outline of a city. Enter Charles Turner, a little-known engineer who would become one of the most influential illusionists of modern warfare. Turner wasn't a battlefield commander. He wasn't a spy. He didn't carry a gun. He carried sketches, blueprints, light diagrams, and from these simple tools he built something extraordinary. Turner was put in charge of what would later be called Q sites, or more famously, starfish sites. He gathered a team unlike any other team in the war. Theatre lighting directors, artists with an eye for perspective, architects who understood building silhouettes, electricians who could manipulate light sources so perfectly that they could mimic an industrial glow, and even pyrotechnic specialists who knew how fire behaves when it consumes different materials. This team wasn't building weapons. They were building illusions, and the success of those illusions would determine whether thousands of real civilians lived or died. Their first challenge was simple to describe, but unbelievably difficult to achieve. Make something fake look real, at night, from the air, while being bombed. Imagine the pressure, imagine the responsibility, because if their work failed even for one night, an entire city might vanish under German bombs. To start, they studied what real cities looked like from above. They collected photos. They analyzed bombing reports. They even examined the reflections that city lights created on the clouds. Then they began crafting meaning out of darkness. Lines of lights placed just far enough apart to resemble city streets. Clusters of dim bulbs imitating factory windows. Large reflective surfaces mimicking rooftops. Fake railway lines built from long strips of metal angled to catch moonlight. Every detail mattered. Where the shadows fell. How bright the glow appeared from 5 miles away. How the layout mimicked real industrial zones. Whether the shape of a building looked convincing enough at 250 million pounds. This was not art for beauty. This was art for survival. In some locations, the team built entire fake factories out of wooden frames covered with painted canvas. In others, they created the illusion of airfields by arranging oil lamps in patterns that formed the outline of runways. And then there were the most dramatic features, the controlled fires. You cannot imagine how realistic these were unless you've seen photos. Engineers designed systems where oil-soaked wood or gas-fed burners could be ignited in strategic patterns. These fires created the exact look of a city already under attack. Smoke, orange glow, flickering destruction. To a pilot flying overhead, the message was clear. We've got a perfect target right here. But behind the scenes, something even more important was happening. Turner's team had to predict how German pilots thought. Not just what they saw, but how they calculated. Bomber crews weren't simply guessing where cities were. They relied on visual markers, coastlines, river curves, road networks, industrial shapes. So the decoy sites had to align with all of it. A fake factory couldn't simply be placed anywhere. It had to sit along the correct railway path. A decoy airfield had to match the angle of real RAF runways in that region. Fires had to burn where actual military targets would be located. Every illusion had to fit the logic of a real city. And Turner's team delivered. Night after night, their designs fooled the Luftwaffe so effectively that German intelligence analysts studying reconnaissance photo days later believed these ghost sites were real. Think about that. Professionals trained to interpret aerial images were fooled by shadows and wooden frames. It wasn't luck. It was art. Weaponized art. What's even more incredible is how quickly these teams worked. In many cases, they built entire decoy installations in 2 weeks. 2 weeks to construct a fake city large enough to be bombed, 2 weeks to coordinate lighting cues, placement of fire traps, and camouflage for the workers who built everything. 2 weeks between idea and reality. And despite the constant threat of air raids, despite the fear that any mistake could cost thousands of lives, these artists didn't back down. They didn't hesitate. They didn't stop to question why stage designers were suddenly protecting a nation. They simply created. Their creations weren't meant to last. They were meant to burn, to catch bombs, to absorb destruction that wasn't meant for them. They were disposable cities with an immortal purpose. Picture this. Somewhere in rural Britain, in the dead of night, a small group of men is crouched beside a large wooden framework. They strike a match. A controlled fire erupts. An engineer flips a switch. Rows of dim bulbs glow softly. Reflections bounce off metal sheets. And within minutes, a fake city wakes up. A city built to die so another one can live. These are the people history rarely talks about. They didn't fire guns. They weren't on the front lines. They weren't celebrated in newspapers. But their contribution was as vital as any soldier, any aircraft, any naval fleet. They protected Britain with illusion, with ingenuity, with imagination. In a war where the enemy tried to destroy everything, these artists built something invisible, something temporary, but something powerful enough to bend the course of history. And the craziest part? Most of them never received recognition. Their work was classified for decades, their names hidden, their contributions buried in documents no civilian could read. Only years later did the truth finally emerge. The architects who saved Britain weren't generals. They were creators. They were the masters of deception. They turned darkness into defense. They turned imagination into armor. They turned illusions into weapons. And because of them, countless real lives survived the Blitz. Picture a dark British countryside in 1941. No streetlights, no headlights, no sound except the distant drone of approaching engines. Every family knows what that sound means. It means another night of fire, another night of fear, another night of praying that the bombs fall somewhere else. But what most families didn't know was that someone had already made sure the bombs wouldn't fall on them. Because miles away, across empty fields and quiet farmlands, Britain had built entire fake cities ready to take the hit. Tonight is one of those nights. The air raid sirens scream across London. RAF spotters report waves of German aircraft approaching the coast. It's another massive Blitz raid. The real London is blacked out, pitch dark, every window blocked, every lamp turned off. The city disappears into the night like a ghost hiding in the shadows. But just 30 miles away, something else appears. Something the Germans absolutely were not expecting. A fake London begins to glow. Lights flicker on in carefully arranged rows. Fake streets come alive with dim yellowish bulbs. The shape of industrial buildings, railway yards, and warehouses appears exactly where German pilots expect them to be. Fire decoys, known as starfish, ignite in controlled patterns, forming giant pools of flame that look like burning oil depots hit by earlier bombs. Thick smoke rises, illuminated perfectly by the orange light beneath it. To a German bomber crew flying at 10,000 feet, this is not a trick. This is not suspicious. This is exactly what they expect to see if they found their target. A city already burning, a city exposed, a city perfectly lit for destruction. So the bombers move in. They bank toward the glow. They line up their targets, and they release their payload. Hundreds of explosives fall toward nothing but imitation structures and controlled fire effects. The ground shakes as the bombs detonate harmlessly. In fields designed to absorb the impact, explosions ripple across open countryside, but miles away, the real London sleeps under total darkness, untouched. Tonight, a fake city saves a real one. And this wasn't a one-time miracle. It happened again, and again, and again. Over the course of the Blitz, German bombers dropped thousands of tons of explosives, but many of those bombs never hit their intended targets. Instead, they were pulled away almost hypnotically toward these brilliant illusions. This is where the story becomes unbelievable. Because these decoy sites didn't just protect London, they protected cities across Britain: Birmingham, Coventry, Bristol, Manchester, Liverpool, Newcastle. Wherever Germany targeted, Britain built illusions to intercept the fire. Some nights, more bombs fell on the fake sites than on the real cities. Imagine that. The enemy thought they were crippling British industry, but in reality, they were destroying wooden frames, painted cloth, and carefully placed lamps. And here's the truly wild part. German pilots often reported successful hits because they saw exactly what they were supposed to see: smoke, flames, structural collapse. But all of it was staged. All of it was fake. All of it was part of a master plan to manipulate the enemy's perception. These decoy sites functioned with precision timing. They couldn't turn on too early, otherwise German pilots would become suspicious. They couldn't turn on too late, otherwise the bombs would strike the real cities. Operators had just minutes, sometimes seconds, to activate the illusion. Picture a small crew of men in a dark bunker, listening to radio reports of incoming aircraft. Their hands are on switches controlling entire landscapes of deception. If they make a mistake, an entire city may face destruction. But they didn't make mistakes. They waited, watched the sky, listened for cues, and at the perfect moment, they activated the fake city. Instantly, the landscape transformed. Shadowy fields became illuminated grids. Fake runways glowed with landing lights. 2 miles of flame burst upward, creating columns of smoke visible from miles away. The illusion came alive with frightening realism, and the Luftwaffe fell for it, again and again. These weren't small raids. Some nights, hundreds of bombers flew over Britain. Some carried high-explosive bombs. Some carried incendiaries meant to burn entire blocks. Some carried parachute, mines powerful enough to destroy anything within 100 yards. But every bomb that fell on a decoy site was a bomb that didn't hit a hospital, a neighborhood, a school, or a factory producing Spitfire engines. The numbers are staggering. Historians estimate that over the course of the war, decoy sites diverted more than 600 bombing raids. They saved entire industrial regions from collapse. They saved tens of thousands of civilian lives. They preserved aircraft plants, munitions factories, and communication centers that were critical to Britain's survival. And the people who made this possible? They weren't soldiers. They weren't celebrated heroes. Most of them worked quietly in the dark, unknown, unrecognized, and unpaid beyond their regular wages. They built illusions that would burn so real cities wouldn't. Now imagine the psychological impact on the enemy. German pilots believed they were destroying Britain. Their maps showed successful strikes. Their intelligence reports confirmed massive fires. But everything was wrong. They weren't crippling Britain. They were bombing stage sets. And because the German high command believed the decoy sites were real industrial areas, they repeated their mistakes. They targeted the same fake cities again and again, convinced they were finishing off the job. This is deception at its highest form. Not just fooling the eye, but rewriting the enemy's understanding of the battlefield. And the most haunting detail of all is this. After every raid, the crews who operated these sites walked through the debris the next morning. Crater after crater, shattered wood, twisted metal, burnt-out decoy buildings, and every time they looked at that destruction, they knew exactly what it meant. Every crater was a family saved. Every burned decoy roof was a neighborhood spared. Every bomb that fell there was a bomb that didn't fall on children, sleeping in the real city miles away. These people, working in silence and secrecy, became the invisible shield that protected Britain. They didn't wear medals. They didn't appear in newspapers. They didn't march in victory parades. Their work was classified for decades. Some of them died without ever telling their families what they had done during the war. But history has finally uncovered the truth. The nights Britain survived. The nights entire cities avoided annihilation. The nights the enemy failed again and again. Those nights were saved by illusions, by deception, by brilliant, strategic, life-saving trickery. This was one of the greatest defensive strategies in the history of warfare. And most people today have never even heard of it. When most people think of World War II, they imagine tanks rolling across Europe, fighter planes dueling in the sky, and cities burning under the Blitz. But there was another battlefield, one that didn't exist on any map. A battlefield made of shadows, illusions, and carefully engineered lies. It was here that Britain created one of the war's most brilliant and least understood defensive strategies. Entire fake cities designed to attract bombs away from the real ones. And nothing illustrates this hidden war of deception better than Britain's Starfish and Q site decoy system. These weren't small tricks or makeshift traps. They were full-scale alternative versions of Britain built in the countryside, replicas of factories, imitation rail yards, dummy runways, and even artificial fires that glowed like burning cities. Their mission was simple: absorb destruction meant for real people. To understand why these decoy cities became so important, you need to know how serious the Blitz was. German bombers returned night after night. They targeted industrial hubs, ports, and densely populated cities. The goal wasn't just to damage Britain, it was to break its spirit. London, Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, every major British city was on the list. The Luftwaffe used navigation, beams, and visual clues to find their targets in the darkness. All they needed were the right patterns of light, the right shadows, the right shapes of buildings or runways. And if those clues could be faked, then the entire German mission could be redirected. That was the genius behind Britain's decoy program. Instead of fighting the bombs head-on, the British planned to pull the bombs toward empty land by giving German pilots something convincing to aim at. And so began one of the greatest deception engineering projects in human history. The first step was understanding how bombers saw cities at night. Scientists and architects studied the glow of real factory fires, the color of burning oil, and the shape of a rail yard lit after dusk. They measured the exact way light bounced off buildings when hit by flames. They documented how burning wood cracked, what direction sparks flew, and how a supply depot looked when hit by high explosives. Then they recreated all of it artificially on remote fields. Under the guidance of a man named Colonel John Turner, dozens of secret teams built these illusions with astonishing precision. A typical Starfish site had long trenches filled with oil and waste fuel. When lit, these trenches produced flames that mimicked the burning streets of a city under attack. They even used valves to control the size of the flames, adjusting them to match real bomb damage. Next to the flames were wooden frames shaped like collapsed houses or factory buildings. When illuminated by the fire troughs, these frames cast realistic shadows from the air. Further out, flashing lights imitated electrical failures or exploding substations. Even the sound of burning debris was recreated with hidden machines and metal plates. Bombers flying thousands of feet above couldn't tell the difference. They saw a burning industrial district and dropped their payloads right into empty land. And every bomb that fell on the decoys was one less bomb falling on hospitals, on schools, on homes where families were hiding in basements trying to stay alive. But the brilliance didn't stop with fire decoys. Q sites were used to mimic airfields. These dummy runways were laid out with reflective surfaces, so that they glowed faintly like real tarmac. Wooden planes were placed along the edges, lights simulated takeoffs and landings. It didn't matter that nothing was real on the ground. What mattered was how everything looked from above. Many Luftwaffe pilots radioed back, claiming they had successfully hit an airfield, not knowing it was nothing more than clever carpentry and a few lamps. One of the most astonishing truths is that the people living near these sites often had no idea what they were living beside. Families sat in their homes, listening to distant explosions, not realizing those explosions were bombs that should have landed on their city, but were instead being drawn away by a decoy field hidden behind a ridge or forest. Many people later recalled seeing flashes in the sky and thinking a nearby town was under attack, only to learn years later that the flashes came from a carefully staged fake fire designed to save their lives. By 1941 and 1942, the results were undeniable. Reports showed some decoy sites were absorbing up to 80 or even 90% of the bombs meant for major cities. That means entire neighborhoods were spared, simply because the enemy was looking at a shadow version of reality. When bombers followed their navigation beams and saw what looked like a burning industrial sector, they assumed they were hitting the real target. They released their weapons without hesitation, and Britain quietly breathed easier. It's hard to imagine the scale. Over 200 decoy sites operated across the country. Some were only used once. Others served for months. Some were destroyed accidentally by the very bombs they attracted. Others remained intact long after the war ended. But every single one represented a blend of engineering, psychology, and raw courage. Because these illusions weren't automated. They had teams of men who had to run into the darkness, ignite the fire troughs at the perfect moment, adjust valves under enemy aircraft, and make sure the illusion was believable. If they lit the fires too early, the Germans would suspect a trap. Too late and bombs might fall on real people. Timing was everything. There's a quiet heroism in that. No medals, no glory. Just a small group of people standing in the cold under enemy aircraft, lighting artificial city fires while the real cities slept safely miles away. They didn't fire guns. They didn't pilot fighter planes. Yet their work saved tens of thousands of lives and preserved entire sections of Britain's industrial backbone. The war might have looked very different without them. By the end of the Blitz, Britain had built a parallel landscape, an entire, imaginary country that existed only to be destroyed. And in being destroyed, it protected the real one. It is one of the greatest examples of how deception can be a weapon, and how creativity can save lives in the darkest of times. At the end of the Blitz, when smoke still hung over, Britain's real cities and families were living in ration lines, air raid shelters and broken neighborhoods. Something astonishing became clear. The Starfish and Q-Site decoy system hadn't just been clever engineering. It had quietly become one of the most effective life-saving defenses of the entire war. To understand how powerful this system truly was, you have to imagine the scale of destruction Britain faced. Night after night, the Luftwaffe returned with relentless precision. Their bombers were equipped with navigation beams, skilled pilots, and strict orders to cripple Britain's factories, ports, and population centers. And yet, despite that, thousands of bombs never reached their intended targets. They vanished into remote hillsides, farmland, empty moors, and coastline fields, because Britain had built an entire illusion network designed to swallow those bombs whole. The success of the decoys didn't happen suddenly. It became clear gradually, through layered intelligence reports, eyewitness accounts, and the patterns that Royal Observer Corps noticed in bomb impacts. In city after city, strange reports started emerging. Bombs that should have landed near dockyards were falling nowhere near the coast. High explosive clusters meant for manufacturing districts were blowing up in open land. Search teams found craters in areas that had no military or industrial value. At first, officials assumed it was German navigational error, but soon the pattern was undeniable. The decoy system was working exactly as intended. One of the earliest signs came from the outskirts of Bristol. German planes approached at night, following their standard flight path. But instead of dropping bombs on the real city, they unleashed them miles away on a hillside, where a Starfish site had been activated moments earlier. Fire tenders at the site later recalled seeing a sudden illumination in the sky, the glow of bombs detonating overhead as the Luftwaffe pilots, fooled by the controlled flames below, misidentified the location as burning Bristol. The real city, fully darkened under blackout orders, remained untouched that night. It was a quiet victory, but it set the tone for what would soon become a nationwide protective shield. And that shield grew. Throughout 1941 and 1942, British intelligence began tracking bomb loss rates. The numbers were staggering. In some regions, decoys successfully attracted over 75% of the bombs dropped in certain raids. In a few critical attacks, the diversion rate even approached 90%, meaning nearly the entire assault force dumped its explosives onto empty land. This wasn't just military success, it was human salvation. Every bomb that exploded harmlessly on a decoy field represented lives saved. Mothers, fathers, factory workers, firefighters, children sleeping in shelters. It also meant Britain could preserve its industrial heart: shipyards, aircraft factories, ammunition depots, and power stations, long enough to continue the war effort. Even German intelligence had no idea they were being fooled. Reports from captured pilots revealed a consistent belief that their missions were successful. They had followed the glow, seen the smoke, observed the shadows cast by burning structures, and confidently released their payloads. Many Luftwaffe crews returned to base believing they had hit major British cities, unaware that what they saw were carefully staged theatrical effects, engineered miles away. That misinformation fed back into German high command, meaning they continued to miscalculate the extent of actual British damage. In a war where morale, production output, and perceived weakness were crucial intelligence factors, this deception created a chain reaction of strategic confusion. The effectiveness of the decoys didn't come cheaply. They required manpower, crews operating fuel troughs, lighting fire tracks, managing valves to mimic the spread of flames, and adjusting patterns to match real city layouts. They also required courage. The men working the starfish sites operated dangerously close to incoming bombers. They weren't soldiers firing weapons, yet they faced one of the highest risk roles imaginable. At the moment a decoy site lit up, it became the most dangerous place in the region. Bombers turned toward it almost immediately. The very success of the illusion placed its operators directly in the path of destruction. Some sites were struck, trenches were blown open, and equipment was destroyed. But they kept operating night after night to keep real cities alive. As the war progressed, the decoy network expanded into a multi-layered defense grid stretching across Britain. There were QL sites that duplicated factory lighting volumes, QF sites that simulated urban fires, Q sites that mimicked runways, and starfish sites that copied entire burning cities. These worked in tandem with radar stations, anti-aircraft defenses, and blackout enforcement to form a strategic system that blended illusion with technology. No other country deployed deception on such a scale during the war. And even after the war ended, much of the network remained classified. Most civilians never knew how close their towns came to destruction, or how often they had been saved by a decoy field they had never seen. By 1945, the full value of these fake cities became clear. Britain's industrial capacity had survived the Blitz, far better than Germany expected. Shipyards still produced vessels. Aircraft factories continued delivering planes. Ammunition lines stayed active despite repeated Luftwaffe attempts to obliterate them. Strategic planners later estimated that without the decoy system, damage would have been dramatically worse, potentially catastrophic. The survival of key production centers helped Britain maintain the momentum needed to support Allied offensives in North Africa, the Atlantic, and eventually in Europe itself. Even decades later, historians studying bomb maps marvel at how many craters lie far from any real target. These maps reveal the powerful ghost layer of a second Britain, one built only to be destroyed. A Britain made of wood frames, tar barrels, fire troughs, oil reservoirs, and electric lamps, but which, in dying, protected the real nation. Remnants of these sites still exist today. Faint outlines of trenches, rusted control valves, fragments of wooden frames. They sit quietly in fields, forests and hilltops mostly forgotten, yet they are monuments to one of the war's great unsung victories. In the final calculation, the starfish and Q-site decoys represent something profound about wartime innovation. They show that victory doesn't always come from firepower. Sometimes it comes from imagination, from understanding the enemy's eyes better than the enemy understands your land, from turning darkness into a weapon and illusion into armor. These fake cities saved tens of thousands of lives and protected the infrastructure that kept Britain fighting. And though they never appeared on the front pages, their shadows shaped the course of the war more than most people will ever realize.